The fog had settled thick over the Thames that September morning in 1887, and the mudlarks were already at work along the bank when the first piece was found. A child saw it first. She did not scream. Children who worked the river knew better than to waste breath on horror. She called to the others, and they gathered in silence around the thing that lay half buried in the silt near the Rainham marshes. It was pale, bloated, wrapped in cloth that had once been white. The fabric clung to the shape beneath like a shroud, and when the older boy pulled it away, they saw what the water had delivered. An arm, severed cleanly above the elbow. The hand still curled as if reaching for something just beyond its grasp. The constable was summoned. He arrived as the tide began to turn, and by the time he reached the bank, the children had found more. A torso, limbless and headless, bound with cord. The flesh had been in the water for days, perhaps a week. The surgeon would later note the precision of the cuts, the care taken in the dismemberment. This was not the work of rage or panic. This was method. This was practice. London had seen murder before. The alleys of Whitechapel knew the taste of blood. The docks of Limehouse concealed their share of sin. But this was something else. This was surgical. This was cold. The fog rolled in heavier as the constable stood over the remains, and somewhere upstream, in the great churning heart of the Empire's capital, the killer moved unseen through the crowds. The first body had surfaced, but it would not be the last. Chapter 1. The River's First Confession. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn its curtain across the world, and wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour, perhaps in a dim room beneath blankets, with only the glow of a screen to keep the darkness at bay, I invite you to settle in. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time has the clock struck in your corner of the world? If you find comfort in these histories, in these whispered tales from centuries past, I ask that you subscribe to this channel. Let us build a sanctuary here, a place where the forgotten and the lost are given voice once more. Now, let us drift backward, not far, only to the autumn of 1887, to the banks of the Thames, to the mud and fog of London at the height of empire. The gaslights flicker in the distance. The river moves slow and dark beneath the bridges, and something terrible has just begun. The morning of October 11th, 1887 broke grey and cold over the Thames estuary. The fog had rolled in during the night, thick as wool, and it clung to the marshes east of London with the stubborn grip of something that knew it belonged there. The river at low tide was a sprawl of black mud and stones, littered with the debris of the city, broken crates, bottles, rope gone green with slime, the bones of small animals picked clean by gulls. The mudlarks were already at work. They came every morning when the tide retreated, these children and women who earned their living by what the river gave up. They moved slowly through the muck, eyes trained downward, hands quick to snatch anything that might be sold. Nails, coal, copper fittings, fragments of pottery. They did not speak much. The work was cold and the hours were long, and words were a luxury saved for warmer places. Near the Rainham marshes, where the river widened and the city's edge began to blur into marshland and farmland beyond, a girl of perhaps 10 years found the package. It lay half submerged in the mud, wrapped in cloth that had once been white, but was now stained brown and grey by the water. The fabric was tied with cord, neat and deliberate, and the shape beneath was heavy, awkward. She did not touch it at first. She called to the others. An older boy came, and then a woman with a sack slung over her shoulder. They stood in a half circle around the thing, their boots sinking slowly into the silt. The boy bent down and pulled at the cord. The knot came loose easily, as if it had been meant to. The cloth fell away. The arm lay pale against the dark mud. It had been severed cleanly just above the elbow, the bone sawn through with precision. The hand was still intact, fingers slightly curled, nails broken and begrimed. The flesh was bloated from days in the water, but the cut was clean. There was no tearing, no ragged edge. Whoever had done this had known what they were doing. The woman sent the girl running for the constable. The boy stayed, staring down at the arm. He had seen bodies before. The river gave them up from time to time. Suicides, accidents, the nameless dead of a city too large to account for all its souls. But this was different. This was not a drowning. This was not despair or misfortune. This was intention. By the time Police Constable William Pennant arrived, The tide had begun to turn. He was a young man, not long in the service, and when he saw what lay in the mud, his face went very still. He asked the mudlarks to stay back, and he began to search the area himself, wading through the shallows with his trousers rolled to his knees. He found the torso 20 yards downstream. It was wrapped in the same kind of cloth, bound with the same neat cord. When he pulled the fabric away, he saw that the limbs had been removed with the same surgical care. The head was gone. The legs were gone. What remained was the trunk of a human body, pale and heavy, marked with cuts that showed no hesitation. The chest had been opened and the organs removed. The cavity was hollow, washed clean by the river. Pennant stood in the water with the remains at his feet, and he felt the fog press closer around him. Somewhere upstream, in the sprawl of London's docks and alleys, in the maze of courts and tenements that line the Thames from Wapping to Westminster, the person who had done this was moving through their day. Perhaps they were eating breakfast. Perhaps they were walking to work. Perhaps they were already planning the next. The remains were carried to the mortuary at Woolwich. The police surgeon, Dr. Charles Hibbert, examined them that afternoon in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of carbolic and damp stone. He laid the pieces out on the table, the torso, the arm, a second arm found later that day, a portion of leg discovered tangled in the reeds. He measured the cuts, noted the angles, ran his fingers along the exposed bone. The dismemberment had been done with a long-bladed knife, sharp and well-maintained. The bones had been sawn through with something heavier, a surgical saw perhaps, or a butcher's tool. The work showed knowledge. Whoever had done this understood anatomy. They knew where the joints were, how the body came apart, how to separate flesh from bone without waste or mess. Dr. Hibbert wrote his report in careful script. Female, age approximately 25 to 30 years, height estimated at 5 feet 3 inches, no identifying marks visible, cause of death unknown, though the absence of water in the lungs suggested she had been dead before entering the Thames. Time in the water, 4 to 7 days, time since death, possibly longer. He closed his notebook and looked down at the remains. In life, she had been someone. She had walked the streets of London, eaten and slept and spoken and breathed. She had a name. She had, perhaps, people who missed her. But now she was only pieces, fragments of a story that had been deliberately erased. The police began their inquiries. Missing persons reports were reviewed. Women who had disappeared in the past weeks were catalogued. The workhouses were contacted, the lodging houses questioned. But London was a city of millions, and women vanished from it every day. Some left for other cities, some fell into the river drunk or despairing, some simply slipped through the cracks of a society that did not care to notice their absence. To identify a woman with no head, no hands, no face, it was nearly impossible. The press caught wind of the discovery within days. The papers called it the Rainham Mystery. They printed sketches of the location, descriptions of the remains, theories about the killer's identity. Was it a doctor? A butcher? A madman with anatomical training? The public read the reports over breakfast and shuddered and turned the page. In the offices of Scotland Yard, Inspector Abberline reviewed the case files. He was a methodical man, patient and thorough, and he understood that this was not a crime of passion. Crimes of passion were messy, frantic, full of rage. This was something colder. This was planning. This was control. He began to map the river, marking the locations where the remains had been found. The Thames was a highway through London, connecting the docks to the city proper, the slums to the wealthy quarters. A body thrown into the water at Westminster might surface miles downstream at Greenwich. A body weighted and sunk might never surface at all. The river was both a tool and a collaborator. Abberline requested that all police divisions along the Thames be alerted. Any discovery of human remains, any suspicious packages, any reports of blood or strange activity near the water, all were to be reported immediately. He had a feeling, a cold certainty settling in his gut, that this would not be the only body. He was correct. On the 11th of November, exactly 1 month after the first discovery, a waterman found a bundle floating near Battersea. It contained a human thigh, severed at the hip and knee, wrapped in cloth identical to that used at Rainham. The flesh showed the same precise cuts. The bone showed the same clean saw marks. 2 weeks later, another package washed up at Limehouse, a section of torso carefully wrapped. No head, no hands, no way to know who this had been. The police began to understand that they were not looking for a single murder. They were looking at a series. They were looking at method. They were looking at someone who killed with regularity and care, who disposed of bodies with the precision of a tradesman discarding waste. The mortuary at Woolwich began to fill with remains. Dr. Hibbert and his colleagues worked in shifts, cataloguing, measuring, searching for any detail that might identify the victims or point toward the killer. But the bodies had been too carefully prepared. The heads were never found. The hands were never found. The killer had taken the parts that mattered, the parts that held identity, and disposed of them elsewhere. In the taverns and shops along the river, people began to talk. They spoke in low voices about the Thames murderer, the torso killer, the demon of the docks. Theories multiplied. Some said it was a foreign sailor who killed in port and vanished back to sea. Some said it was a resurrection man, a body snatcher gone mad. Some said it was a member of the medical establishment, a doctor hiding his crimes behind professional knowledge. The police had no answers. They had remains, they had locations, they had methods, but they had no witnesses, no murder scenes, no names. The victims were ghosts and the killer was smoke. As November turned to December and the fog thickened over the city and the gaslights burned dim in the gathering dark, the people of London began to realise that something was moving through their streets that they could not see and could not stop. The river flowed on, dark and patient, carrying its secrets toward the sea. And in some quiet room, in some corner of the city unknown to justice, the killer sat in lamplight and considered the next. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of Silence. The mortuary at Woolwich was a building that seemed to have absorbed cold into its very walls. It stood near the arsenal, a low brick structure with narrow windows set high and a single iron door that opened onto a courtyard where the police vans delivered their grim cargo. Inside, the air was sharp with carbolic acid and formalin, scents meant to mask the smell of death, but which only mingled with it, creating something worse. Dr. Charles Hibbert had worked in this room for 7 years. He had examined the drowned and the stabbed, the poisoned and the burned, the victims of accidents and the victims of malice. He considered himself a man beyond shock, a professional who could look upon any horror with the detachment required by science. But the remains that arrived through the winter of 1887 tested even his composure. They came in pieces, wrapped in cloth, sometimes in carpet, once in a section of curtain fabric that still showed a pattern of flowers. Each package was bound with cord or twine, tied with knots that varied, sometimes a simple overhand, sometimes a more complex binding that suggested knowledge of rope work, perhaps experience at sea or in trade. The killer was not consistent in this detail, which frustrated the detectives who hoped to find a signature, a pattern they could trace. But the dismemberment itself was utterly consistent. That was what disturbed Hibbert most. The cuts were clean, made with a sharp blade drawn smoothly through flesh. The joints were disarticulated with precision, opened exactly where the ligaments attached, suggesting someone who understood skeletal structure. The bones were sawn through with steady strokes, no hesitation marks, no false starts. This was not the work of someone learning as they went. This was practiced. On the morning of December the 3rd, Hibbert stood over his examination table with Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon from Westminster, and Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who worked primarily in the East End. They had been called together to review the evidence collectively, to pool their expertise and see if 3 minds might discern what one had missed. The table held the remains from 3 separate discoveries. They had been cleaned and arranged anatomically as far as possible, a partial torso here, limbs there, sections of tissue and bone laid out like pieces of a puzzle that could never be completed. Bond spoke first. He was a thin man with greying whiskers and hands that never seemed entirely still. He gestured toward the larger section of torso, indicating the cut that ran along the abdomen. "The incision here follows the linea alba," he said quietly, "the natural seam of the abdominal wall. A surgeon would know to cut there. It opens the cavity cleanly, allows access to the organs. See here." He pointed with a metal probe. "The peritoneum has been cut through, the intestines removed. No tearing, no damage to surrounding tissue. This was done carefully, with time and light to work by. Phillips leaned closer, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air. The removal of the organs suggests a purpose beyond disposal. Either the killer wished to reduce the weight for easier transport, or, he paused, considering his words, or there was some other motive. Collection, perhaps. Study. Hibbert nodded slowly. All of the recovered torsos show this same evisceration. The organs are never found with the remains. He takes them, or disposes of them separately. Bond straightened, his face drawn. And the decapitation. Always between the 4th and 5th cervical vertebrae, always a clean cut through the intervertebral disc. No hacking, no sawing through bone. He knows where to place the blade. The three men stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the December wind rattled the high windows. Somewhere in the arsenal a bell rang the hour. Phillips walked slowly around the table, examining each section of remains from different angles. "We must consider," he said finally, "that we may be looking for someone with medical training. A physician, a surgeon, an anatomist. Someone who has spent time in a dissection room. Or a butcher," Hibbert offered. "The meat trades require similar knowledge. How to break down a carcass efficiently, where to cut, which tools to use." Bond shook his head slightly. "A butcher works with animal anatomy. These cuts show understanding of human structure specifically. The way the hip joints are disarticulated, for instance. That is not the same as butchering a pig or cow. The anatomy is different." "Then a medical man," Phillips said, "or someone who has studied anatomy in some capacity. A hospital attendant, perhaps. A medical student who did not complete his training." They returned to the table. Hibbert lifted one of the severed arms, turning it slowly in the light. The hand was missing, severed at the wrist with the same precision that marked all the other cuts. "He takes the hands and heads," Hibbert murmured. "Always. Those are the parts that can identify. Fingerprints, facial features, dental characteristics. Without them, we have nothing." "He knows that," Bond said flatly. "He knows exactly what he is removing and why. This is not madness. This is calculation." Phillips moved to the window, looking out at the grey sky. "Then we're hunting a man of intelligence, a man who plans, who understands both anatomy and investigation, a man who knows what the police will look for and how to deny it to them." Hibbert covered the remains with a sheet. "The question becomes, why? What drives a man to kill in this manner? Not rage, clearly, not the heat of passion. This is cold, this is methodical. Perhaps," Bond said slowly, "that is the answer. Perhaps the method itself is the motive. Perhaps he kills not for revenge or profit or lust, but simply to practice this dismemberment, to perfect it." The room fell silent again. It was a chilling thought, and yet it fit the evidence better than any theory of ordinary murder. An ordinary killer left traces of emotion, overkill, or hesitation, or panic. This killer left only precision. The doctors completed their examination and wrote their reports. Copies were sent to Scotland Yard, to the Home Office, to the police divisions along the Thames. The findings were discussed in low voices in the offices of the Metropolitan Police, in the halls of the Royal College of Surgeons, in the newspaper rooms where reporters gathered information like carrion birds. The Times ran a carefully worded article on December 10th. It did not use the word serial, for that term had not yet been coined, but it spoke of a systematic campaign of murder and a criminal of unusual cunning. The article noted the precision of the dismemberment and suggested that the killer might possess medical knowledge. It urged anyone with information to contact Scotland Yard immediately. The response was overwhelming and useless. Dozens of people came forward claiming to have information. They accused doctors who had treated them poorly, neighbours they disliked, foreigners who seemed suspicious. Every anatomist in London became a potential suspect in the eyes of a nervous public. The police investigated each claim and found nothing. The real killer remained invisible. In the East End, where poverty ground people down and life was cheap, the working women whispered among themselves. They knew that some of the victims were likely women like them, women who walked the streets at night, who took men to lodging houses for a few coins, who lived outside the protection of law and society. They knew that such women disappeared regularly and no one remarked upon it. But this was different. This was not just murder. This was erasure. Inspector Abberline walked the streets along the Thames talking to beat constables, to dock workers, to the keepers of common lodging houses. He asked about strangers, about men who came and went at odd hours, about anyone who might have access to medical instruments or anatomical knowledge. He compiled lists, checked alibis, pursued leads that dissolved like fog in daylight. He visited the medical schools, St. Thomas's, Guy's, the London Hospital. He spoke to professors who taught anatomy, asked to see their dissection rooms, inquired about missing instruments or suspicious students. The professors were offended by the implications, but they cooperated. None could think of anyone capable of such crimes. Their students were gentlemen, they insisted, men of learning and respectability. Abberline knew better. He knew that respectability was often a mask, and that the worst monsters sometimes wore the most civilized faces. But knowing that and proving it were different matters entirely. As the year drew to its close, the police had compiled a substantial file on the Thames Torso Murders. They had descriptions of the remains, maps of the discovery locations, theories about the killer's knowledge and methods. They had interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses and investigated dozens of suspects. They had consulted with the best medical minds in London, and they had nothing. No name, no face, no idea where the killer lived or worked or hunted. The victims remained unidentified. The murder sites remained unknown. The killer's motive remained obscure. In the mortuary at Woolwich, the remains waited in storage, preserved in formalin, catalogued and numbered. They would wait for years, for decades. They would wait for answers that would never come. Dr. Hibbert stood alone in the examination room on the last day of December. The year was dying, and outside the window the sky was already dark, though it was only 4 in the afternoon. He thought about the bodies he had examined, the care with which they had been taken apart. He thought about the person who had done this work, who had stood over a body with a blade and reduced a human being to anonymous pieces. Somewhere in London, that person was still walking free. Perhaps they were eating their evening meal. Perhaps they were reading the newspaper accounts of their crimes. Perhaps they were already planning the next. The thought made Hibbert very cold. He turned down the lamp and locked the door behind him, and he walked out into the December night where the fog was rolling in from the river, thick and white, and concealing everything. Chapter 3. The Second Delivery. The winter of 1888 came hard to London. The Thames froze at its edges, and the fog that rose from the water seemed to carry the cold deep into the bones of anyone who walked near it. The poor huddled in their tenements and lodging houses, burning whatever they could find for warmth. The wealthy retreated behind thick walls and heavy curtains, their fires stacked high with proper coal. And the river continued to give up its dead. On the 5th of January, a lighterman working near Horsley Down discovered a parcel caught in the wooden pilings of an old wharf. The tide was out, and the package lay half in the mud, wrapped in what appeared to be a section of cheap curtain fabric, the kind sold in the markets for a few pence per yard. He pulled it free and felt the weight of it, the awkward heft of something that shifted inside its wrapping. He knew before he opened it what it would be. Everyone who worked the Thames knew by now. The stories had spread along the docks, through the warehouses, into every tavern and shop that lined the water. The torso killer was still at work, and the river was his preferred means of disposal. Inside the wrapping was a human leg, severed at both hip and knee. The cuts were clean. The flesh was pale from its time in the water. The lighterman set it down carefully and went to fetch a constable. By noon the leg was in the mortuary, and by evening Dr. Hibbert had confirmed what everyone already suspected. The dismemberment matched exactly the pattern of the previous victims. Same precision, same knowledge, same deliberate removal of identifying features. The foot had been cut off at the ankle, taken away like the hands and heads before it. 3 weeks later, on the 28th of January, a boy fishing near Battersea Bridge snagged something heavy with his line. He pulled it up and found a bundle wrapped in canvas. Inside was a section of human torso, the chest cavity opened and emptied, the ribs sawn through with methodical care. The police were called. The remains were photographed, measured, removed. The newspapers ran their stories. The public read and shuddered and went about their business. What else could they do? Life in London continued, indifferent to the horrors being pulled from its river. February brought more. A thigh found at Limehouse, an arm at Greenwich, another section of torso at Woolwich, not far from where the first discoveries had been made the previous autumn. Each find was reported, examined, catalogued. The files at Scotland Yard grew thicker. The map on Inspector Abberline's wall gained new marks, new pins connected by string, showing the drift of the current and the possible points of entry into the water. He stood before that map in the early days of March, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes tracing the pattern of discoveries. The Thames flowed from west to east through London, from the wealthy districts of Westminster and Chelsea, through the commercial heart of the city, and out past the docks of Wapping and Rotherhithe, to the estuary beyond. A body thrown into the water in one location might surface miles away, depending on the tide, the current, the weight of the corpse. The killer seemed to favour the western reaches of the river. Most of the discoveries had been made downstream of Westminster, but the bodies themselves had likely entered the water somewhere in the central or western districts. That suggested someone who lived or worked in those areas, someone who had access to the river at night, when the docks were quiet and the streets were dark. But that description fit thousands of men. Dock workers, watermen, sailors, merchants, tradesmen of every variety. And then there were the men whose professions gave them knowledge of anatomy. The doctors, the medical students, the hospital attendants, the men who worked in the teaching hospitals and surgical theatres. Abberline had interviewed dozens of them. All had alibis, or colleagues who vouched for them, or reputations that made such accusations absurd. The inspector sat down at his desk and opened the case file once more. Inside were the reports from the various police surgeons, the statements from witnesses who had found the remains, the lists of missing women who might or might not be among the victims. He read through them again, searching for something he had missed, some detail that might break the case open. The victims appeared to be women, based on skeletal structure and the shape of the recovered pelvic bones. Young women, generally between 20 and 35 years of age. They had been dead before entering the water. The surgeons agreed on that point. There were no signs of drowning, no water in what remained of the lungs. They had been killed elsewhere, dismembered elsewhere, then transported to the river for disposal. But where was elsewhere? The police had searched, had knocked on doors along the river, had questioned residents about strange smells or sounds, about basements or workshops where such work might be done. They had found nothing. No blood-soaked rooms, no caches of medical instruments, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. It was as if the killer worked in a space that did not exist, a phantom room where bodies could be taken apart and the evidence erased before anyone noticed. Abberline closed the file and rubbed his eyes. He was a practical man, not given to flights of imagination, but he could not shake the feeling that they were hunting someone who moved through London like a ghost, leaving only pieces behind. March turned to April, and the discoveries continued. Not frequently, sometimes weeks would pass between findings, but regularly enough to confirm that the killer had not stopped. A portion of pelvis near Putney, a section of ribcage at Blackfriars. Another arm, this one small, suggesting a woman of slight build, found tangled in the chains of a moored barge at Wapping. The newspapers had grown almost bored with the story. It was no longer shocking. It had become routine, another feature of London life, like the fog or the beggars or the endless noise of the streets, the Thames Torso Murders they called them now, the unsolved enigma of the river. Theories were proposed, debated, dismissed. Some papers suggested the killer had emigrated or died, or simply grown tired of his work. Others insisted he was still among them, walking the streets, blending into the crowds. In the public houses of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, where the working poor gathered in the evenings, people spoke in low tones about the murders. They wondered if the killer was one of them, a neighbour, a man they saw every day. They wondered if he would ever be caught, or if he would simply vanish into history, another mystery in a city full of mysteries. The police continued their work. New constables were briefed on the case. Patrols along the Thames were increased. Anyone seen loitering near the water at night was questioned. But London was too large, too chaotic, too full of hiding places. The killer remained free. In May, as spring brought warmer weather and the river smelled worse than ever, a package was found at Somerset House, in the heart of the city. It had been placed, not thrown, but placed, on the steps leading down to the water. Inside was a human torso, complete with the arms but missing legs and head. The precision of the cuts was, by now, familiar. The emptiness of the chest cavity was expected. The absence of anything that might identify the victim was understood. But the location was different. This was not a discovery made by chance, by mudlarks or fishermen or dock workers. This was a delivery. This was the killer placing his work directly in view, close to the centres of power and law, a message that he could operate anywhere at any time and remain unseen. Inspector Abberline stood on those steps in the grey morning light and looked at the remains. He felt a cold anger settling in his chest. This was arrogance. This was the killer showing them that he was beyond their reach. He turned to the constables who had secured the scene. "I want every building within 200 yards searched, every resident questioned, every tradesman, every clerk, every servant. Someone saw something. Someone knows something." The search was thorough and time-consuming. Hundreds of people were interviewed. The buildings along the Strand were examined room by room. The police worked through the day and into the night. With lanterns and determined faces, they found nothing. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The killer had left his package and vanished like smoke. As June arrived, bringing long evenings and the thick smell of the river in warm weather, the people of London began to understand that this case might never be solved. The Torso murders had become a fact of life, something terrible and permanent, woven into the fabric of the city. In the mortuary at Woolwich, the storage room was nearly full. Dr. Hibbert had run out of space and had begun requesting permission to bury some of the remains. They had been examined, photographed, measured. They had given up all the information they were going to give. There was no reason to keep them any longer, except that they represented people who had once lived, and burying them without names felt like a final erasure. But permission was granted, and on a grey afternoon in late June, several of the unidentified remains were buried in a pauper's cemetery south of the river. There were no mourners, no ceremony, just a priest who read the words quickly and a gravedigger who filled in the earth. Somewhere in London, the killer continued his life. Perhaps he read about the burial in the newspapers. Perhaps he felt satisfaction, knowing that his victims would go to their graves as nameless as he intended them to be. The summer stretched ahead, long and hot, and the Thames flowed on, patient and dark, waiting for the next delivery. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Whitechapel. The summer of 1888 was hot and close, the kind of heat that settled over London like a blanket and would not lift. The streets baked during the day and radiated warmth through the night, and in the tenements of the East End, people slept with their windows open and prayed for rain that did not come. August brought no relief. The air hung thick and still, carrying the smell of the river, of refuse, of too many bodies pressed too close together. In Whitechapel, where the streets were narrow and the buildings leaned against each other like exhausted soldiers, the heat was worst of all. The lodging houses were ovens. The alleys were furnaces. People moved slowly, their faces slick with sweat, their tempers short. And in those same streets, in those same alleys, something new began to unfold, something that would consume the attention of the police, the press, and the public so completely that the Thames Torso murders would fade into shadow, still happening, still unsolved, but no longer the focus of the city's fear. On the 7th of August, a woman named Martha Tabram was found dead in George Yard buildings, stabbed 39 times. The violence was shocking, frenzied, nothing like the cold precision of the Torso murders. This was rage made manifest, a fury that had spent itself on her body and left her sprawled on the landing of a tenement staircase. The police investigated, the newspapers reported. The people of Whitechapel shook their heads and whispered that the streets were becoming more dangerous, though in truth they had always been dangerous for women who walked them alone at night. 3 weeks later, on the 31st of August, another woman was found. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, discovered in Bucks Row with her throat cut and her abdomen slashed open. The wounds were deep, deliberate, done with some knowledge of where to cut. The police surgeon who examined her noted the almost surgical nature of some of the incisions. Inspector Abberline was called to the scene. He had been working the Torso murders for nearly a year, and when he looked down at Mary Ann Nichols, he felt a cold recognition. The throat cut was different. The Torso killer never left throats attached. But the abdominal mutilation, the opening of the body cavity, the deliberate nature of the wounds, these things resonated with something familiar. But the differences were significant too. This body had been left intact, not dismembered. The face was present, the hands were present. She could be identified. She had been killed where she lay, or very near to it, the blood pooling beneath her on the cobblestones. The Torso killer always killed elsewhere, always took the bodies apart in private, always disposed of them carefully. 2 different killers, Abberline concluded, 2 different methods, 2 different purposes, but both operating in London at the same time, both targeting vulnerable women, both using blades with terrible skill. On the 8th of September, Annie Chapman was found dead in the backyard of a lodging house on Hanbury Street. Her throat was cut, her abdomen opened, her intestines draped over her shoulder. Parts of her had been taken away, the uterus, sections of bladder. The precision of the removal suggested anatomical knowledge, perhaps medical training. The papers erupted. The name that had been whispered after Polly Nichols became a headline now. Jack the Ripper, they called him, a name that came from a letter sent to the press, though whether from the killer himself or some opportunistic hoaxer, no one could say. The name stuck. It sang in the headlines, rolled off tongues in every public house and market stall. Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel fiend, the terror of the East End. The Torso Murders were forgotten. The papers barely mentioned them anymore. The public's attention had shifted entirely to the spectacle in Whitechapel, to the visible horror of bodies left in streets and yards, to the clear and present danger that walked among them. But the torso killer did not stop working. While London's eyes were fixed on Whitechapel, the river continued to receive its deliveries. On the 3rd of September, between the murders of Nichols and Chapman, a section of human arm was found at Pimlico, near the Chelsea embankment. The cut was clean, the work familiar. It was reported in a small paragraph on page 7 of the Times, beneath updates on the Whitechapel investigation. On the 21st of September, a leg was discovered at Battersea. Again, the notice was brief. The Torso Murders had become routine, unremarkable. They no longer sold papers. Inspector Abberline found himself stretched between 2 investigations. He attended the murder scenes in Whitechapel, coordinated with the police divisions, reviewed the medical reports. But he also kept track of the river discoveries, maintained his map, updated his files on the torso cases. He felt as if he were hunting 2 ghosts, and neither would let itself be seen. The police presence in Whitechapel increased dramatically. Constables patrolled the streets in pairs, questioned anyone out late at night, searched lodging houses and yards. The vigilance committees were formed, local men who walked the streets with sticks and lanterns, self-appointed guardians who accomplished nothing but gave the residents a sense of doing something. And still the Ripper struck. On the 30th of September, 2 women were killed in one night. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut but her body otherwise unmutilated, as if the killer had been interrupted. Catherine Eddowes was discovered 45 minutes later in Mitre Square, butchered with a savagery that made even the police surgeons turn pale. Her face had been mutilated, her abdomen opened, organs removed. A section of her kidney was taken away. London was in uproar. The double murder sparked panic. Women refused to walk alone. Shops closed early. The streets of the East End became hostile territory after dark, patrolled by police and vigilantes and frightened by every shadow. And in this chaos, on the 4th of October, another discovery was made in the Thames. A human torso, neatly wrapped, found floating near Westminster Bridge. The dismemberment was precise, the work familiar. Dr. Hibbert examined it and added it to his collection of the unidentified. The newspapers gave it 3 sentences. Abberline stood in his office at Scotland Yard and looked at the 2 sets of files on his desk. The Whitechapel murders on the left, the Torso Murders on the right. 2 killers, both surgical in their way, both targeting women, both evading every attempt to find them. He wondered if they knew about each other, if they read the papers and saw their work reflected and distorted. He wondered if one of them envied the fame the other was receiving. The Ripper was infamous now. His name was known across Britain, across Europe, across the world. Letters poured in from people claiming to be him, from people claiming to know him, from people offering theories and solutions and wild accusations. The police were drowning in false information, chasing leads that went nowhere, investigating suspects who could not possibly be guilty. The torso killer remained invisible. No one wrote letters claiming to be him. No one gave him a theatrical name. He simply continued his work, methodical and patient, leaving pieces in the river and moving on. November arrived, cold and damp. The heat of summer was a memory. replaced by fog and drizzle and the bone-deep chill of a London autumn. On the 9th of November, the Ripper committed his final and most horrific murder. Mary Jane Kelly was found in her rented room in Miller's Court, her body so thoroughly mutilated that the police report described it only in clinical terms, unable to capture the full extent of what had been done to her. The scene was different from the others. This had been done indoors with time and privacy. The killer had spent hours with the body, taking it apart, arranging the pieces, working through some dark purpose that only he understood. When the police photographer finished his work and the body was removed to the mortuary, the men who had witnessed the scene walked out into the November morning with pale faces and shaking hands. After Mary Kelly, the Ripper vanished. There were no more murders that matched his pattern, no more bodies found in Whitechapel with throats cut and abdomens opened. Theories proliferated. He had died. He had been institutionalized. He had fled the country. He had been arrested for some other crime. The truth was unknown then and remains unknown now. But the torso killer continued. While the papers debated the Ripper's disappearance and London slowly relaxed its vigilance, the river kept giving up its dead. On the 17th of November, a section of leg was found at Greenwich. On the 2nd of December, an arm surfaced near Woolwich. The pattern held. The precision remained. The killer worked on, unnoticed by a city that had exhausted its capacity for fear. Inspector Abberline attended a meeting at Scotland Yard in mid-December. The commissioner wanted an update on the Whitechapel investigation. Abberline reported what little progress had been made, which was to say none. The Ripper had left no useful evidence, no witnesses who had seen anything definitive, no trail that could be followed. After the meeting, Abberline returned to his office and sat with the torso murder files. He had given them less attention in recent months, and he felt guilty about that. These victims deserved investigation as much as the Rippers, but the public did not care about them. The papers did not write about them, and so the police resources went where the pressure was greatest, and the torso murders remained in shadow. He opened the most recent report, read the surgeon's notes on the leg found at Greenwich. Same method, same knowledge, same careful removal of identifying features. He closed his eyes and tried to picture the man who did this work. Where did he live? Where did he kill? How did he choose his victims? How did he move through London without being noticed? The questions had no answers. They had never had answers. And as the year drew to its close, as Christmas approached and the city decorated itself with holly and candles and false cheer, Abberline had to accept that he might never find them. The torso killer had operated for over a year. He had claimed at least 6 victims, possibly more. He had worked through summer and winter, through panic and investigation, through the Ripper's reign and the Ripper's disappearance, and he remained unknown, unnamed, unseen. Somewhere in London he was living his life. Perhaps he had a job, a home, people who knew him and thought him ordinary. Perhaps he was sitting down to Christmas dinner, carving meat with skilled hands, smiling at conversation. The thought made Abberline very cold. He closed the files and locked them in his desk. Outside, the December darkness had fallen early, and the gaslights burned yellow in the fog. The year 1888 was ending. It had been a year of horrors, of murders that shocked even a city hardened to violence, and through it all, quiet and methodical, the Thames killer had continued his work, hidden in the shadow cast by a more famous monster. Chapter 5. The Vault Beneath Whitehall. The construction of the new Scotland Yard building had been underway for years. It stood on the Victoria Embankment, close to the river, a red brick fortress that would house the Metropolitan Police headquarters when it was finally completed. The site had been chosen for its prominence, its accessibility, its symbolic placement at the heart of London's governance and law. Through the autumn of 1888, the construction continued despite the chaos in the streets. Workers came and went, hauling materials, laying bricks, fitting windows. The building rose slowly, floor by floor, its eventual completion delayed by funding problems and architectural disputes. But the work went on, and by September, the foundation was complete, and the lower levels were being prepared for use. It was in one of these lower levels, in a vault intended for storage of police records, that the discovery was made. The vault was dark and damp, as all basement rooms near the river tended to be. It had been excavated the previous year, the earth dug out and carried away in carts, the floor laid with stone. During construction, it had been used to store building materials, timber, bags of lime, coils of copper pipe. The workers came and went without paying much attention to the space. It was just another room, nothing special, nothing worth noting. On the morning of October 2nd, a foreman named Thomas Brennan descended into the vault to check on some piping that was being installed. He carried a lantern, for the space had no windows and the gaslight had not yet been connected. The flame threw shadows on the walls, made the vault seem larger and more cavernous than it was. He was checking the pipes along the eastern wall when he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable beneath the scents of damp stone and fresh mortar. But as he moved deeper into the vault, it grew stronger, sweet and sick, the unmistakable smell of decomposition. Brennan stopped. He had worked construction for 20 years and had encountered dead animals before, rats, cats, sometimes dogs that had wandered into building sites and gotten trapped. He expected to find something similar here. He moved his lantern slowly, searching the floor and walls for the source. He found it in the corner, partially concealed by a stack of timber that had been left there weeks ago. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags, the kind of thing workers sometimes left behind. But when he moved closer and the light fell fully upon it, he saw the pale curve of flesh, the dark stain on the stone beneath. He did not touch it. He stood very still for a moment, his breath shallow, his heart beating fast. Then he turned and climbed the stairs quickly, calling for the site supervisor. By noon the police had arrived. By afternoon the vault had been sealed, and the remains were being examined in situ by Dr. Thomas Bond, who had been called from his office at Westminster. He descended into the vault with several constables, their lanterns making the space bright and stark, throwing every detail into sharp relief. The remains were human. That much was immediately clear. They had been wrapped in a dark cloth, possibly a section of curtain or blanket, and tied with cord. The wrapping had come partially undone, revealing what lay inside. It was the torso and upper legs of a woman. The head was gone, the arms were gone. The legs had been severed mid-thigh. The dismemberment showed the same precision that had marked all the previous torso murder victims. Clean cuts, careful disarticulation, no hesitation. But there was something different about this discovery. The body was fresh. It had been here for days, not weeks. The flesh had not yet bloated significantly, had not yet been consumed by the river or scavenged by animals. This was a recent death, and the disposal had been made not in the Thames, but here, in the foundation of the very building meant to house the police force hunting the killer. Dr. Bond worked carefully, documenting everything before the remains were moved. He noted the precision of the cuts, the removal of the head and hands, the evisceration of the torso. The uterus had been removed, taken away as it had been in several of the previous cases. The work was familiar to him now, after examining so many similar victims. This was the Thames killer's signature, no question. But the location was extraordinary. The killer had brought a body here, to this construction site, to this building that would become Scotland Yard. He had descended into this vault, had unwrapped his grim package and left it in the corner, had climbed back up and walked away into the London streets. It was audacity bordering on madness. Or perhaps it was not madness at all. Perhaps it was message. Perhaps the killer was demonstrating his contempt for the police, his confidence that he could walk among them and remain unseen. Inspector Abberline arrived at the site in the late afternoon. He stood at the entrance to the vault and looked down into the lamplight where the constables were still working. He felt a cold fury settling in his chest. This was mockery. This was the killer spitting in their faces. He descended the stairs and spoke with Dr. Bond, who was washing his hands in a bucket of water. The surgeon's face was drawn and tired. He had examined too many bodies in the past year, had spent too many hours in mortuaries and murder scenes. "It is the same killer," Bond said quietly. "No question. The dismemberment is identical to the others, and the timing fits. This death occurred within the last week, possibly less." Abberline looked at the corner where the remains had been found. "How did he get in here? This is a construction site. There are workers here during the day, watchmen at night. How did he carry a body down into this vault without being seen?" "Perhaps he did not carry it all at once," Bond suggested. "Perhaps he brought it in pieces, wrapped so as not to draw attention." A bundle carried by a workman would not seem unusual on a construction site. "Then he either works here," Abberline said slowly, Or he has access to the site. He knows the layout, knows when the watchmen make their rounds, knows where he can go without being questioned. Bond nodded. That is my assessment as well. This was not an opportunistic disposal. This was planned. He chose this location deliberately. Abberline turned to the constables. I want a list of every man who has worked on this site in the past month. Every labourer, every tradesman, every supervisor. I want to know who has been here, when they were here, and what their background is. And I want the watchman questioned. Someone saw something. Someone must have. The investigation began that evening and continued through the following days. The workers were interviewed one by one. Most were local men, labourers who had worked construction sites all over London. They knew nothing about the body, had seen nothing suspicious, had no knowledge of anyone behaving strangely. The watchmen were questioned more intensively. They made rounds through the night, checking the site for intruders or damage. But they admitted that the site was large, that there were many places a man could enter if he was determined. The fence around the perimeter was not high. The gates were sometimes left unlocked by workers who returned after hours to retrieve tools. It became clear that the killer could have entered the site at night without much difficulty. If he had dressed as a workman, carried his burden in a sack or bundle, moved with confidence, he could have walked past anyone without drawing attention. London was full of men carrying things, moving through the streets at all hours. One more would not have been noticed. The newspapers discovered the story within 2 days. The headlines were sensational. Torso found in New Scotland Yard. Murderer leaves body at police doorstep. The killer's message. The articles speculated wildly. Was this the same man as Jack the Ripper? Were the Torso Murders and the Whitechapel murders connected? Was the killer a police officer himself, someone with inside knowledge? The public was horrified and fascinated in equal measure. The idea that a killer could leave a body in the very building meant to house the police seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. That London was beyond control, that evil could move freely, that authority was powerless. Inside Scotland Yard, the mood was grim. The Commissioner called meetings with senior officers, demanding progress, demanding answers. The Home Office sent inquiries. Members of Parliament asked questions. The pressure to solve the Torso Murders, which had been building slowly over the past year, suddenly intensified to a breaking point. Inspector Abberline worked 18-hour days, reviewing files, coordinating searches, following every possible lead. The construction site was searched thoroughly. Every room, every space, every corner was examined. No further remains were found. No evidence was discovered. The killer had left nothing behind but the body itself. Dr. Bond attempted to identify the victim. She was young, perhaps 20 to 25 years old. She had been well nourished, not starving like so many of the poor women in the East End. Her hands had been removed so there were no fingerprints. Her head had been taken, so there was no face to compare with missing persons' descriptions. She was, like all the others, anonymous by design. The police checked records of missing women. They questioned lodging housekeepers, prostitutes, anyone who might know of a woman who had disappeared recently. But London was a city where women disappeared every day. Some ran from bad situations. Some died of disease or accident. Some simply moved on to other cities, other lives. Finding one specific missing woman in that sea of vanished souls was nearly impossible. The investigation continued through October, but the leads grew cold. The initial burst of activity produced nothing substantial. The killer had left no trail, no witnesses, no mistakes. The body in the vault became another file, another set of remains in the mortuary, another unsolved case added to the growing pile. By the end of the month, the newspapers had moved on to other stories. The public's attention shifted. The construction of the new Scotland Yard building continued. Workers returned to the vault, installed the shelving and gas lights, prepared it for its intended use. The stain on the floor where the body had lain was scrubbed away. The space was cleaned and made ready. And in the streets above, the killer walked free. Perhaps he read the papers and smiled at the chaos he had caused. Perhaps he felt satisfaction at having breached the police headquarters itself, at having left his mark in the very seat of law and order. Or perhaps he felt nothing at all. Perhaps the location meant nothing more to him than any other disposal site. Perhaps he had chosen it simply because it was convenient, because it was empty at night, because he knew he could get in and out without being seen. Inspector Abberline stood in his office in the old Scotland Yard building, looking out at the Thames. The water was dark in the November twilight, and somewhere out there he knew there might be more bodies, more pieces waiting to be discovered, more victims of a man who killed with cold precision and vanished without trace. The case was no closer to being solved than it had been a year ago, when the first remains were found at Rainham. If anything, it had become more complex, more frustrating. The killer was not escalating, not becoming reckless. He was continuing his work with the same methodical care he had shown from the beginning. Abberline turned away from the window. He had other cases to work, other crimes to investigate. But the Torso murders would stay with him, would occupy the back of his mind, would trouble his sleep for years to come. Somewhere in London, the killer was preparing for the next one. Somewhere in the city's shadows, another woman would soon disappear, would be reduced to pieces, would be erased from the world as thoroughly as if she had never existed at all. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Logic. The medical community of London in the late 1880s was a close world of lecture halls and hospitals, of societies and journals, of men who knew each other by reputation if not by acquaintance. When the Torso murders began, these men watched with professional interest and growing unease. The precision of the dismemberment, the anatomical knowledge displayed, the surgical skill evident in every cut, these things suggested that one of their own might be responsible. It was not a comfortable thought. The medical profession prided itself on healing, on the advancement of knowledge in service of humanity. The idea that a doctor or surgeon might be using that knowledge to kill and mutilate was deeply disturbing, yet the evidence was difficult to ignore. In the lecture hall of the Royal College of Surgeons on Lincoln's Inn Fields, a group of distinguished physicians and surgeons gathered in late November of 1888 to discuss the matter. The meeting had been called by Dr. Frederick Trevis, a surgeon at the London Hospital and a lecturer on anatomy. He had examined the police reports on the Torso murders and had reached conclusions he felt needed to be shared with his colleagues. The hall was panelled in dark wood and lit by gas lamps that cast shadows in the corners. The men who gathered there wore dark suits and serious expressions. They took their seats in the tiered rows and waited for Trevis to begin. He stood at the lectern with a folder of papers before him. He was a compact man with sharp features and careful hands, known for his skill in surgery and his clarity in teaching. He began without preamble. "Gentlemen, I have asked you here to discuss a matter that touches upon our profession in an unfortunate way. You're all aware of the series of murders that have come to be known as the Thames Torso cases. I have been consulting with Scotland Yard on these matters, and I have reviewed the medical reports compiled by Doctors Hibbert, Bond and Phillips. What I will tell you tonight is based upon their observations and my own analysis of the evidence." He paused, looking out at the assembled faces. Some he knew well, others only by reputation. All were men of learning, men who understood anatomy and pathology, men who would grasp the implications of what he was about to say. The dismemberment of the victims shows clear evidence of anatomical knowledge. The cuts are made at the correct locations for disarticulation, at the joints, where the bones meet and the ligaments attach. The person doing this work understands skeletal structure. They know where to cut to separate limbs efficiently. He opened the folder and withdrew several drawings that had been made from the police photographs. He held them up one at a time, showing the clean cuts through joints, the precise separation of bone and tissue. Furthermore, the use of instruments. The flesh is cut with a sharp blade, likely a surgical knife or scalpel. The bones are sawed with something that leaves marks consistent with a medical saw. These are not kitchen implements. These are professional tools, or tools of equivalent quality. A murmur ran through the audience. Dr. Richard Caton, a physiologist from Liverpool who was visiting London, raised his hand. Could not a butcher possess such knowledge and tools? The meat trade requires similar skills. Trevis nodded. That is a fair question. And yes, a skilled butcher would know how to disarticulate joints and separate meat from bone. However, there are differences between human and animal anatomy that suggest more specific knowledge. The human pelvis, for instance, is quite different from that of a pig or cow. The way these bodies have been taken apart shows understanding of specifically human structure. Another physician spoke from the back row. What of the evisceration, the removal of organs? Also significant, Trevis replied. In several cases, specific organs have been removed, the uterus particularly. The abdominal cavity has been opened cleanly, following the linea alba, exactly as a surgeon would do when performing an abdominal operation. The organs have been extracted without damage to surrounding tissue. This requires knowledge not just of anatomy but of surgical technique. The room was silent now, the men absorbed in the grim implications. Trevis continued. The removal of the head and hands is also telling. These are the parts that allow identification. A layman might think to remove the face, but might not realize the importance of the hands. Fingerprints are increasingly used in identification. A man with medical or police knowledge would understand this. "Are you suggesting," said Dr. Edmund Owen, a surgeon from St. Mary's Hospital, "that the killer is a member of the medical profession?" Trevis closed the folder carefully. "I am suggesting that the killer has medical knowledge, or knowledge equivalent to it. Whether he is a qualified physician, a medical student, a hospital attendant, or someone who has studied anatomy through other means, I cannot say. But the skill displayed in these dismemberments is not that of a common criminal. This is someone who has spent time learning how the human body is constructed and how it can be taken apart." The discussion that followed was intense and uncomfortable. The physicians debated whether such knowledge could be acquired outside formal medical training. Some argued that an intelligent man with access to anatomical texts could teach himself. Others insisted that the surgical skill evident in the cuts required practical experience, hours spent with scalpel and saw in a dissection room or operating theatre. Dr. Thomas Bond, who had been invited to the meeting, stood to speak. He had examined more of the torso murder victims than anyone else, and his opinion carried weight. "I have considered this question at length," he said, "and I have reached a conclusion that disturbs me greatly. Whoever is doing this work has not only knowledge but practice. These are not the cuts of someone attempting dismemberment for the first time. There is no hesitation, no false starts, no awkward sawing. This is someone who has done this before, perhaps many times." "But where?" someone asked. "Where does one practice such a thing?" "In a dissection room," Bond said quietly. "In a medical school working on cadavers, or in an operating theatre assisting with surgeries, or in a morgue preparing bodies for burial. There are professions that provide this experience legitimately. The question is whether our killer pursued such a profession, or whether he found other means to practice." The meeting ended without resolution, but with a shared sense of unease. The physicians left the hall and walked out into the November night, troubled by the idea that medical knowledge could be turned to such dark purposes. In the following weeks, Scotland Yard intensified its investigation of medical men. Inspector Abberline compiled lists of surgeons, physicians, medical students, hospital attendants, anyone whose profession or training gave them anatomical knowledge. The lists were long. London had dozens of hospitals, multiple medical schools, hundreds of men with the requisite knowledge. Each name was investigated as resources allowed. Alibis were checked for the nights when bodies were believed to have been disposed of. Colleagues were interviewed about behaviour, temperament, any signs of instability. The process was slow and yielded nothing definitive. The medical men of London were by and large respectable citizens with solid alibis and no apparent motive for murder. But Abberline could not shake the feeling that the answer lay somewhere in those lists. Someone with medical training, someone who moved through the hospitals or schools, someone who had access to instruments and private spaces. The killer was there somewhere, hidden among the respectable and the qualified. Dr. Hibbert, in his mortuary at Woolwich, continued his examinations. Each new discovery was measured and documented with care. He had become something of an expert on the torso killer's method, could identify the killer's work from a single cut. It was not an expertise he had sought, but it was one he had acquired through grim necessity. He sometimes wondered, late at night when the mortuary was silent and empty, whether the killer took pride in his work, whether he saw it as a kind of artistry, a demonstration of skill. The cuts were so clean, so precise. They showed a care that went beyond mere disposal. This was someone who took time, who worked methodically, who wanted each dismemberment to be perfect. The thought was chilling. Most murderers killed in passion or for profit, and their violence was messy, chaotic. But this killer was organized, controlled. He killed for reasons that had nothing to do with normal human motivation. Perhaps he killed simply to practice his craft, to refine his technique, to see how perfectly he could reduce a human being to component parts. In December, the medical journal The Lancet published an article discussing the torso murders from a clinical perspective. The author, writing anonymously, analysed the dismemberment technique and concluded that the killer almost certainly had professional medical training. The article was read widely, both within the medical community and beyond. It sparked debates in newspapers and public houses, fueled speculation about which doctor or surgeon might be responsible. The medical establishment closed ranks. The Royal College of Surgeons issued a statement expressing confidence that no qualified medical man could be responsible for such crimes. The hospitals reviewed their staffing and found no suspicious individuals. The medical schools examined their student rolls and reported nothing unusual, but privately many doctors wondered. They knew that medical training did not guarantee moral character. They knew that intelligence and skill could be found in cruel men as easily as in kind ones. They knew that somewhere in their profession, or adjacent to it, there might be someone who had learned to cut and saw and separate, and who had chosen to use that knowledge in the worst possible way. Inspector Abberline met with Dr. Trevis in mid-December to discuss the investigation. They sat in Trevis's office at the London hospital, a small room lined with medical texts and anatomical drawings. Outside the window, the December afternoon was already darkening. "I have investigated every lead," Abberline said. "Every doctor who has been reported acting strangely, every medical student with a troubled past, every hospital attendant with a criminal record. Nothing. Either our man is hiding his nature perfectly, or I am looking in the wrong places." Trevis poured them both tea from a pot on his desk. "There is another possibility, that the killer is not currently practicing medicine. Perhaps he was a medical student who did not complete his training. Perhaps he was dismissed from a hospital position for some infraction. Perhaps he learned anatomy through books and observation rather than formal education." "That widens the field considerably," Abberline said. "I know, but consider. If the killer were a practicing surgeon or physician, he would have limited time and opportunity. He would have patients to attend, duties to fulfill. His absence would be noted. But if he is someone outside the profession, someone with knowledge but not responsibilities, he could move more freely." Abberline sipped his tea thoughtfully. "That makes sense. But it also makes him harder to find. At least with active medical men, I have lists, institutions, records. How do I find a man who studied medicine years ago and is now working in some other capacity?" "I do not know," Trevis admitted. "But I think you must consider that possibility. The killer may once have been part of the medical world but is no longer. He may have left under a cloud, or simply chosen another path. He retains the knowledge and skill but not the position." They talked for another hour, reviewing theories, discussing possibilities. When Abberline left, he felt no closer to a solution, but perhaps slightly clearer on the scope of the problem. He was looking for someone who might be anywhere, doing anything, living any sort of life. The only certainty was that somewhere in London that person existed, and that they would likely kill again. Chapter 7. The River's Rhythm. The year 1889 began cold and grey, the Thames running high with winter rains. The city was quieter now than it had been during the autumn panic. The Ripper had not struck again after Mary Kelly, and though people remained cautious, the immediate terror had faded. Life in London returned to its usual rhythm of work and survival, poverty and commerce, the endless churning of millions of souls pressed together in streets too narrow to contain them. The Torso Murders continued, but they had become part of the background noise of urban violence. The papers still reported the discoveries, but usually on the inner pages, in brief paragraphs that noted the location and the familiar pattern of dismemberment. The public had grown accustomed to the idea that bodies would appear in the Thames, that they would be found by workers and fishermen, that they would be examined and catalogued and ultimately buried without names. On the 4th of January, a mudlark working near Battersea found a human leg wrapped in canvas. The cuts were clean, the work familiar. It was delivered to the mortuary and added to Dr. Hibbert's collection. He examined it with the same methodical care he had shown for all the others, measuring the bones, noting the precision of the saw cuts, recording his findings in neat script. 3 weeks later, on the 23rd of January, another discovery was made at Limehouse. A section of torso, the chest opened and emptied, wrapped in cloth that had once been part of a dress. The fabric was cheap cotton, the kind worn by working women throughout the East End. It provided no clues to identity. The body had been in the water for several days, the flesh bloated and discoloured, but the dismemberment was as precise as ever. Inspector Abberline visited the mortuary that afternoon. He stood over the examination table and looked at the remains without speaking. He had seen so many by now that they had begun to blur together in his memory. They were all the same: pale flesh, clean cuts, careful disposal. The victims had become interchangeable, reduced to their component parts, stripped of everything that made them individuals. Dr. Hibbert finished his examination and washed his hands. "The same killer," he said. It was almost a ritual now, this confirmation. Same method, same instruments, same knowledge. "How many does this make?" Abberline asked. Hibbert consulted his records. "This is the 9th confirmed discovery since October of 1887, but there may be more. Some remains may have sunk and not surfaced. Some may have washed out to sea. We can only count what we find. 9 women, at minimum. 9 lives ended and erased, reduced to pieces floating in the Thames." Abberline felt the weight of those numbers, the accumulation of failure. Nearly a year and a half of investigation, and they were no closer to identifying the killer than they had been at the beginning. He thanked Hibbert and walked out into the January afternoon. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled of smoke and river water. He returned to Scotland Yard and sat at his desk, staring at the map on his wall. The pins marked every discovery location, connected by string that showed the possible drift patterns in the river. It looked like a spider's web, complicated and meaningless. February brought more rain. The Thames rose further, flooding the lower embankments, turning the mudflats into expanses of brown water. The mudlarks stayed away, waiting for the river to subside. The watermen rowed carefully, avoiding debris that floated past on the strong current. On the 10th of February, a barge worker found a package caught in the chains of his mooring near Westminster. It contained an arm severed at shoulder and elbow, the hand removed at the wrist. The wrapping was oilcloth, the kind used to protect cargo from water. It had kept the flesh relatively preserved, though the limb had clearly been in the river for at least a week. The discovery was reported to Scotland Yard. A constable collected the remains and delivered them to Woolwich. Dr. Hibbert added them to his files. The investigation continued in its slow, futile way. March arrived with cold winds that swept up the river and made the bridges shudder. The construction workers finishing the new Scotland Yard building worked quickly, trying to complete their tasks before the weather worsened. The vault where the body had been found the previous October was now in use, filled with file cabinets and boxes of records. The stain on the floor had long since been scrubbed away. It was as if nothing had happened there, as if the killer's mockery had been erased. But Abberline could not forget. Every time he passed the building, he thought about the audacity of that disposal, the message it had sent. The killer could go anywhere, do anything, and remain beyond reach. It was a demonstration of contempt, a reminder that intelligence and planning could defeat even the most determined investigation. On the 28th of March, another discovery was made. A torso found floating near Southwark Bridge, wrapped in carpet and weighted with stones. The weights had not been sufficient, or perhaps the killer had not tied them securely. The package had risen to the surface and been spotted by a customs officer making his morning rounds. The remains showed the same careful dismemberment. The head was gone, the limbs were gone, the chest cavity was empty. The victim was female, young, otherwise unidentifiable. Dr. Hibbert examined her and added her to his list. Number 11, assuming his count was accurate. 11 women taken apart and scattered in the river over the course of 18 months. The police had interviewed hundreds of people by now. They had investigated dozens of suspects, searched countless locations, followed leads that always ended in disappointment. The killer left no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the bodies themselves. He killed somewhere private, transported the remains carefully, disposed of them in the river where the water would wash away any trace of where they had been. It was the perfect system for concealment. The Thames was both disposal site and accomplice, carrying the bodies away from the murder location, scattering them across miles of waterway, erasing evidence with its cold flow. By the time the remains were discovered, they had been so altered by water and time that forensic examination could reveal almost nothing useful. Inspector Abberline began to wonder if the case would ever be solved. Some murders remained mysteries forever, their perpetrators never caught, their victims never identified. Perhaps the Torso Murders would be added to that grim catalogue. Perhaps decades from now, some future detective would open these files and shake his head at the inadequacy of Victorian police work, at the impossibility of catching a killer who understood how to exploit the city's geography and the limitations of criminal investigation. The thought was bitter. Abberline had dedicated his career to justice, to the idea that patient work and careful reasoning could solve any crime, but this case was teaching him that some criminals were simply too clever, too careful, too patient. The Torso Killer had shown no signs of the recklessness that eventually brought most murderers down. He did not boast, did not escalate, did not leave clues. He simply continued his work, methodical and invisible. April came with warmer weather and longer days. The river smelled worse as the temperature rose, the water carrying the accumulated waste of the city out toward the sea. The mudlarks returned to their work, picking through the exposed mud at low tide, searching for anything of value. On the 3rd of April, a child found a bundle near Wapping. Inside was a human leg severed at hip and knee. The cuts were clean. The work was familiar. It was brought to the mortuary and examined and filed away. On the 21st of April, a waterman discovered a section of torso floating near the tower. The chest had been opened, the organs removed. The victim was female, young, unidentifiable. Dr. Hibbert conducted his examination, wrote his report, added another entry to his growing catalogue of the dismembered dead. May arrived, and with it a brief respite. No discoveries were made that month. No grim packages surfaced in the Thames. The police began to wonder if the killer had stopped, or died, or moved to another city. But Abberline knew better than to hope. The killer had gone quiet before, had allowed weeks to pass between disposals. Silence did not mean cessation. It meant only that the bodies had not yet been found. June proved him correct. On the 7th, a torso was discovered at Greenwich, wrapped in sailcloth and tied with rope that showed the knots of someone familiar with maritime work. The dismemberment was precise, the victim anonymous. Number 14, by Dr. Hibbert's count, though he acknowledged that the number was approximate, that other remains might have been missed or misidentified. The summer months were slow. July and August passed with only one discovery, a leg found near Blackfriars in late August. The heat made the river smell terrible, and the police patrols along the embankment were reduced as officers were reassigned to manage the crowds at public parks and festivals. September arrived with cooler weather and morning fog that rolled off the Thames like smoke. The city prepared for autumn, for the shorter days and longer nights, for the cold months ahead. And on the 10th of September, the last confirmed discovery of 1889 was made. It was found at Pinchin Street in Whitechapel, not in the river but under a railway arch. The location was unusual, a departure from the killer's normal pattern of disposal. The remains were a complete torso with the legs still attached, but the head and arms had been removed. The body had not been in water. It was relatively fresh, the death recent. The discovery sparked immediate speculation. Was this the torso killer, or was this someone else? The location in Whitechapel brought back memories of the Ripper, though the dismemberment suggested the torso murderer's work. The police investigated thoroughly, questioning residents near the railway arch, searching for witnesses who might have seen someone carrying or disposing of the body. Dr. Bond and Dr. Phillips examined the remains together. They noted the precision of the cuts, the careful disarticulation of the limbs, the methodical approach to dismemberment. It matched the torso killer's pattern, but the disposal was different. Why had this body been left on land rather than thrown into the river? Had the killer been interrupted? Had he changed his method deliberately? The questions had no answers. The Pinchin Street torso, as it came to be called, remained a mystery within a mystery. It might have been the work of the Thames killer, or it might have been a copycat, someone who had read about the dismemberments and decided to attempt their own. Inspector Abberline stood under the railway arch where the body had been found and looked around at the dark bricks, the narrow passage, the shadows that gathered even in daylight. This was not the river. This was not the killer's usual territory. Something had changed, or something had gone wrong. But what? He had no way to know. The case remained as opaque as it had been from the beginning. A series of bodies without context, a killer without identity, a crime without solution. As autumn deepened and the year moved toward its end, the discoveries stopped. October passed, then November, then December. No more remains were found. The Thames flowed on, dark and patient, but it gave up no more bodies. The police continued their investigations, but with less intensity now. Other crimes demanded attention. Other cases needed solving. The Torso murders faded from immediate concern, becoming part of the historical record rather than active investigation. Dr. Hibbert maintained his files, kept his records current, preserved the remains in his mortuary storage. He knew that someday someone might return to this case, might ask to review the evidence, might hope to find something that had been missed. He wanted to be ready for that day, wanted the documentation to be complete and accurate. But privately he doubted that day would ever come. The killer had been too careful, too skilled, too patient. He had left nothing that could identify him, nothing that could lead the police to his door. He was a ghost who left only pieces behind, a shadow who moved through London and vanished without trace. As the year 1889 drew to its close, the Torso murders remained unsolved. The victims remained unidentified. The killer remained free. Chapter 8. The Disappeared. In every city there are people who vanish without explanation, who walk out of their lives one day and are never seen again. Some leave deliberately, fleeing bad situations or starting fresh elsewhere. Some meet with accidents, their bodies lost in rivers or ruins. Some fall victim to crime, to violence that leaves no witnesses and no trace. In London during the late 1880s, women disappeared with particular frequency. The city was vast and impersonal, and a woman alone had few protections. Those who worked the streets, who took men to lodging houses for money, who survived on the margins of respectable society. These women were especially vulnerable. They moved through a world that barely acknowledged their existence. And when they vanished, few people noticed or cared. The police kept records of missing persons, but the records were incomplete. Many disappearances were never reported. A woman who had no family, no permanent address, no employer who would miss her. Such a woman could vanish entirely, and the only record of her existence would be a name in a lodging house register, or a description given to police by someone who barely knew her. Inspector Abberline understood this. He knew that the Thames Torso victims had almost certainly come from this population of vulnerable women. They were not wealthy ladies whose disappearances would spark intensive investigations. They were not respectable working women with families who would demand justice. They were women on the edges, women whose absence left barely a ripple. But he believed they deserved justice nonetheless. He believed that every victim, regardless of station, deserved to be identified and avenged. So he spent long hours reviewing missing persons reports, trying to match descriptions to the fragmentary remains in Dr. Hibbert's mortuary. The work was frustrating and largely futile. The reports were vague. A woman in her 20s, brown hair, average height, last seen wearing a dark dress. Such descriptions could match hundreds of women, and without a face or hands to compare, without any distinguishing marks visible on the recovered remains, identification was nearly impossible. In February of 1889, Abberline compiled a list of women who had been reported missing in the months corresponding to the Torso murders. The list contained 43 names. Some had probably left London of their own accord. Some had died of natural causes or accident, their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace. But some, perhaps, were among the victims pulled from the Thames. He visited the common lodging houses in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, places where women paid fourpence for a bed in a dormitory room. The keepers of these houses knew their residents only superficially. They collected the money and enforced basic rules, but they did not inquire into the women's lives or backgrounds. Women come and go, one keeper told Abberline. She was a heavy woman with tired eyes. Standing in the doorway of her lodging house on Flower and Dean Street. They stay a few nights, a few weeks, then they move on. I don't ask questions. As long as they pay, they can stay. When they stop paying, they leave. Do you remember any women who disappeared suddenly? Abberline asked. Who stopped coming back without explanation? The keeper shrugged. It happens all the time. A woman will come in regular for a month, then one night she doesn't show up. Maybe she found better lodgings. Maybe she left London. Maybe she died in an alley somewhere. I don't know. I can't keep track of everyone. Abberline showed her sketches that had been made of some of the Torso victims, reconstructions based on the recovered bones and tissue. The keeper looked at them and shook her head. Could be anyone. Could be women I knew. Could be strangers. You can't tell from these pictures. He visited the workhouses, those grim institutions where the destitute could seek shelter in exchange for labour. The administrators kept better records than the lodging house keepers, but even they could not account for every woman who passed through their doors. Women leave the workhouse regularly, one administrator explained. He was a thin man with a grey beard sitting behind a desk piled with ledgers. They find work, or they decide they prefer the streets to the rules here. We note their departure in the register, but we have no way to track where they go afterward. Have any women left and then been reported missing? Abberline asked. Not reported to us, no. But that doesn't mean they aren't missing. It simply means no one thought to inquire here. Abberline reviewed the workhouse registers, noting names and departure dates. He cross-referenced them with the dates of the torso discoveries, looking for patterns. But the numbers were overwhelming. Dozens of women left the workhouses every month. Trying to determine which of them might have become victims was like searching for specific grains of sand on a beach. He spoke with police constables who worked the streets of the East End, men who knew the prostitutes and flower sellers and match girls who populated the area. Did they remember women who had suddenly vanished? Women who used to work a particular corner or alley, but were no longer seen? The constables tried to help, but their memories were imperfect. Women drift in and out of the area all the time, one constable said. They work Whitechapel for a while, then they move to Bethnal Green or Shoreditch. Or they get arrested and spend time in jail, or they get sick and go to hospital. There's no way to keep track. Abberline visited the hospitals, asking about women who had been admitted and died, whose bodies might have been taken for anatomical study. But the hospital records showed no irregularities. Bodies used for dissection were properly documented, accounted for, eventually buried in marked graves. None had gone missing. He visited the mortuaries where unclaimed bodies were kept before burial. He examined the records of deaths registered in the months surrounding the torso discoveries. But again, the documentation was thorough. Bodies were counted, examined, disposed of through proper channels. There was no indication that any had been stolen or misappropriated. The killer was obtaining his victims somewhere. But where? How did he find them? How did he lure them to wherever he did his work? The victims must have gone with him willingly, at least initially. There were no signs of struggle on the remains, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest they had been dragged or forced. Perhaps he posed as a client, offering money for companionship. Perhaps he presented himself as respectable, someone who could be trusted. Perhaps he offered shelter or food or assistance. However he approached them, the women had followed him to their deaths, unsuspecting until it was too late. Dr. Hibbert had theorized that the women were killed before the dismemberment began. The cuts were too clean, too precise to have been made on a living, struggling victim. The killer probably used chloroform or some other anesthetic, rendering the woman unconscious before he began his work. Or perhaps he simply strangled them, a quick death followed by the methodical task of taking the body apart. The thought of it chilled Abberline. The cold calculation involved, the transformation of a living person into raw material for dismemberment. The killer saw his victims not as human beings, but as objects to be processed, reduced, disposed of. It was a profound form of dehumanization, a complete absence of empathy or conscience. In June of 1889, a woman named Elizabeth Jackson was reported missing. She had been a prostitute working in Chelsea, known to police and to the other women in the area. She had been 4 months pregnant when she vanished. Her friend said she'd gone out one evening to find a client and had never returned. A few days after her disappearance, remains began surfacing in the Thames. A torso was found at Battersea. A thigh was discovered near Limehouse. An arm surfaced at Westminster. The pieces were collected and examined, and Dr. Hibbert determined that they all came from the same body, a young woman, approximately 4 months pregnant. The pregnancy was the identifying feature that had not been removed. The killer had taken the head and hands, had emptied the chest and abdomen, but the uterus had contained the evidence that allowed Dr. Hibbert to connect the remains to Elizabeth Jackson. She became the only torso victim to be positively identified. Her friends confirmed the timeline, confirmed her pregnancy, confirmed that she had disappeared at exactly the right time to match the discovery of the remains. An inquest was held and the verdict was murder by person or persons unknown. Elizabeth Jackson was buried in a pauper's grave in Woolwich. A few of her friends attended the brief ceremony. There was no headstone, just a wooden marker with a number. She had been given back her name, but in death she remained anonymous. One more woman buried in an unmarked grave in a city that had too many of them. Inspector Abberline attended the burial. He stood at a distance, watching the simple coffin being lowered into the earth, and he felt the weight of all the other unidentified victims. At least Elizabeth Jackson had a name now. At least someone knew who she had been. But the others remained ghosts, reduced to pieces, their identities lost forever. He wondered if the killer knew their names. He wondered if the women had spoken to him before they died, had told him who they were, where they came from, who might miss them. Or had he not bothered to ask? Had he seen them only as anonymous bodies, as material for his work? The question had no answer. The killer had never spoken, never left messages explaining himself. He simply continued his work in silence, taking women from the streets, reducing them to parts, scattering them in the river. As the summer progressed and the discoveries continued, Abberline added more names to his list of possible victims, women who had been reported missing, women who matched the age and description of the remains. But without definitive evidence, he could not confirm their identities. They remained possibilities, probabilities, never certainties. The disappeared women of London haunted him. He thought about them late at night, when sleep would not come and the city outside his window was quiet. He thought about their lives, the poverty and desperation that had led them to walk the streets at night. He thought about their last moments, the trust they must have placed in the man who killed them, the realization that must have come too late. They deserved better than they had received. They deserved safety and security and lives that did not end in dismemberment and anonymous burial. But Victorian London had failed them, as it failed so many of the poor and vulnerable. The city ground people down, used them up, discarded them when they could no longer be useful. And somewhere in that vast grinding machine of a city, the killer continued his work, adding more women to the list of the disappeared, more bodies to the river, more mysteries that would never be solved. Chapter 9. The Final Fragment. The autumn of 1889 came quietly to London, the summer heat fading into cool mornings and damp afternoons. The leaves turned brown and fell from the plane trees along the embankment, and the Thames took on the grey colour it would keep through the winter months. The city prepared for the cold season ahead, the poor dreading it, the wealthy making arrangements to pass the worst months in warmer climates. The Torso Murders had been part of London life for 2 years now. The initial shock had long since faded. The discoveries were still reported in the newspapers, but with less prominence, less sensational language. The public had grown accustomed to the idea that bodies would surface in the Thames, that they would be examined and buried and forgotten. It had become background noise, another grim fact of urban existence. Inspector Abberline continued his investigation, but with diminishing resources. The case had produced no useful leads, no promising suspects, no evidence that might break it open. The Home Office was growing impatient with the lack of progress. Other crimes needed attention. The Metropolitan Police could not continue dedicating significant manpower to a case that seemed unsolvable. In September, Abberline was reassigned to other duties. He would still oversee the Torso murder investigation, but only nominally. The day-to-day work would be handled by junior officers, men who would file the reports and follow up on any new discoveries, but who would not have the time or resources for intensive detective work. Abberline accepted the reassignment without protest. He understood the practical realities. The case had defeated him, and he was honest enough to admit it, at least to himself. 2 years of work, hundreds of interviews, countless hours of investigation, and he was no closer to identifying the killer than he had been at the start. The murderer had outwitted him, had operated with such care and planning that no trace had been left behind. On the 10th of September, the body was found at Pinchin Street. Abberline was called to the scene in the early morning when the fog still hung thick in the streets. He walked under the railway arch where the torso lay and looked down at the remains. The dismemberment was familiar. The head removed, the arms removed, the chest opened and emptied. But the location was different, and that troubled him. Why had the killer changed his method? For 2 years the bodies had gone into the Thames, had been disposed of in the water where they would drift and decay and wash away evidence. But this body had been left on land in Whitechapel, under an arch where it was certain to be found quickly. Was it a message? A taunt? Or had something gone wrong? Had the killer been interrupted or forced to abandon his usual disposal method? Abberline supervised the examination and removal of the body. Dr. Bond came to the scene and confirmed that the dismemberment matched the torso killer's pattern. But he too was puzzled by the location, by the deviation from established practice. Perhaps he's becoming less careful, Bond suggested. Perhaps the confidence that has protected him thus far is leading to recklessness. Or perhaps this is not the same killer, Abberline said. Perhaps this is someone else, someone who has read about the Torso Murders and decided to copy them. They had no way to know. The Pinchin Street torso remained an enigma, possibly the work of the Thames killer, possibly the work of an imitator. The investigation proceeded, but it yielded nothing new. The victim could not be identified. No witnesses had seen anyone carrying or disposing of the body. The railway arch yielded no useful evidence. As September turned to October, Abberline waited for the next discovery. The killer had been operating regularly for 2 years. There was no reason to think he would stop now. But October passed without any new bodies surfacing. November came and went, cold and grey, and the Thames gave up nothing but the usual urban detritus. Dead animals, broken furniture, the accumulated waste of millions of people. December arrived, and still nothing. The river froze at its edges, and the mudlarks worked carefully, breaking through thin ice to reach the mud beneath. But they found no human remains, no wrapped packages, no evidence of the torso killer's work. As the year drew to its close, the police began to wonder if the murders had finally stopped. Perhaps the killer had died, or moved to another city, or simply grown tired of his work. Perhaps the Pinchin Street torso had been his final act, a last murder before he vanished into history. Or perhaps, Abberline thought, the bodies were simply not being found. Perhaps the killer had perfected his disposal method, had learned to weight the packages properly so they sank and stayed sunk. Perhaps the remains were resting on the river bottom, slowly decomposing, never to surface and be discovered. The thought was deeply unsettling. How many victims might there be that had never been found? How many women had disappeared into the Thames, their bodies successfully concealed, their deaths unrecorded? The case files were moved to storage in the new Scotland Yard building, filed away in the vault where the body had been found the previous year. The irony was not lost on Abberline. The investigation was being stored in the very place the killer had chosen to mock them. Dr. Hibbert continued to maintain his records at the mortuary in Woolwich. He kept the remains preserved, kept his notes current, kept hoping that someday new evidence might emerge or new techniques might allow the victims to be identified. But he knew, as Abberline knew, that the case was effectively over. No new resources would be dedicated to it. No breakthrough was likely to occur. As 1890 began, the Torso Murders faded from public consciousness. The newspapers stopped reporting on them. The people of London moved on to other concerns. The Thames flowed on, dark and patient, keeping its secrets. In the lodging houses of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, women continued to disappear. Some died of disease, some of violence, some simply moved to other cities or other lives. The disappeared were not mourned, not remembered. They left barely a trace, their existence acknowledged only in fragmentary records that few people would ever read. Inspector Abberline retired from the Metropolitan Police in 1892. He had served for 29 years, had worked hundreds of cases, had seen the worst that humanity could offer. But the Torso Murders stayed with him, haunted him in retirement. He had failed to solve them, failed to identify the victims, failed to bring the killer to justice. In his later years, when journalists would ask him about the famous cases he had worked, the Ripper murders, the Torso Murders, the various crimes that had made headlines in his career, he would speak carefully, choosing his words with precision. About the Ripper, he would say that the case remained frustrating, that several suspects had seemed promising but none could be conclusively proven guilty. About the Torso Murders, he would say less. He would note the precision of the dismemberment, the apparent medical knowledge of the killer, the complete absence of useful evidence. And then he would fall silent, his eyes distant, his mind returning to those cold mornings by the Thames, looking down at pieces of human beings, knowing that someone in London had done this work and would never be caught. Dr. Hibbert worked at the mortuary until his retirement in 1898. Before he left, he compiled a final report on the Torso murders, summarising all the examinations he had conducted, all the evidence he had collected, all the conclusions he had reached. The report was thorough and professional, a testament to careful forensic work. But the final paragraph acknowledged what everyone already knew, that the killer's identity remained unknown, that the victims remained largely unidentified, that the case remained unsolved. The report was filed away at Scotland Yard, added to the boxes of documents already stored there. It would remain in those files for decades, occasionally reviewed by police historians or crime researchers, but never leading to any new breakthroughs. The Thames Torso Murders became a historical curiosity, a Victorian mystery, a case study in how a careful killer could evade detection. Theories would be proposed over the years, suspects suggested, connections drawn to other crimes. But no definitive answers would ever emerge. The river itself remained the most constant element. It continued to flow through London, carrying the city's waste and secrets toward the sea. It had received the bodies, had carried them through its dark waters, had eventually given them up to discovery. It had been witness to the killer's work, accomplice to the disposal, keeper of the evidence, and perhaps, in its depths, it still held secrets. Perhaps there were remains that had never surfaced, victims who had never been found. The Thames had seen London through plague and fire, through war and peace, through centuries of human existence. It had witnessed countless deaths, absorbed countless bodies. A few more made little difference. The final fragment of the Torso murders was not a piece of a body, but a piece of history, a case that ended not with resolution, but with silence, not with answers, but with absence. The killer had done his work and vanished, leaving behind only questions and the pale remains of anonymous women. Somewhere in London's records, in some forgotten file or dusty ledger, there might be the killer's name. Perhaps he died in a hospital or workhouse, his death recorded by some clerk who had no idea of what he had done. Perhaps he emigrated, took ship to Australia or America, lived out his life under a different name. Perhaps he simply continued to live in London, an ordinary citizen, indistinguishable from thousands of others, carrying his secrets to the grave. The victims remained in their unmarked graves in Woolwich and other pauper cemeteries around London. They had been buried without names, without ceremony, without anyone to mourn them. The city that had failed to protect them in life had failed to remember them in death, and the Thames flowed on, dark and eternal, moving through the heart of London like a vein of cold water, carrying the city's secrets toward the sea, keeping its counsel, revealing nothing. Chapter 10. The Coldwater's Keep. The 20th century arrived in London with celebrations and optimism, a sense that the new era would bring progress and enlightenment. The gaslight was giving way to electricity, the horse-drawn carriage to the motor car, the Victorian age to something modern and clean. The city looked forward, eager to leave behind the darkness of the previous century. But some things could not be left behind. Some crimes remained unsolved. Some mysteries remained impenetrable. The Thames Torso murders were filed away in the archives of Scotland Yard, relegated to history, but they were not forgotten. They remained a puzzle that had defeated the best investigators of their time, a demonstration that even in the age of modern policing and forensic science, some criminals could simply vanish into the fabric of the city. The files sat in their boxes in the basement of Scotland Yard, gathering dust. Occasionally a researcher would request access, would spend hours reading through the reports and examining the photographs. They would review the evidence, study the maps, consider the theories that had been proposed and discarded. And they would reach the same conclusion that Abberline and Hibbert and Bond had reached, that the killer had been too careful, too skilled, too patient to be caught. The remains stayed in their storage vaults for years. Dr. Hibbert had preserved them with formalin, had kept them in sealed containers with proper documentation. He had believed that someday new forensic techniques might allow identification, might provide answers that Victorian science could not give. But as the years passed and the techniques improved, no one thought to apply them to these old remains. There were more pressing cases, more recent crimes, victims whose families still lived and demanded justice. In 1923, the decision was made to finally dispose of the unidentified remains from the Torso murders. They had been kept for over 30 years, long past the point where they served any practical purpose. The victims had never been identified, the killer had never been found, and the storage space was needed for more current cases. The remains were cremated in a ceremony attended only by a police chaplain and 2 officers assigned to witness the disposal. The ashes were scattered in an unmarked location. The documentation was filed away, noting the date of disposal and the closure of that chapter of the investigation. With the destruction of the remains, the last physical evidence of the crimes disappeared. What remained were only papers, reports, photographs, sketches, witness statements. These stayed in the files, preserved now not for investigative purposes but for historical record. The case was occasionally revisited by crime historians and researchers interested in Victorian murder. Theories proliferated. Some suggested the Torso killer had been a doctor working at one of London's hospitals, someone with access to anatomical knowledge and private spaces where the dismemberment could be done. Others proposed that the killer had been a butcher or meat processor, someone whose profession provided both knowledge and cover for the acquisition of cutting tools. More dramatic theories connected the Torso murders to other famous Victorian crimes. Some researchers suggested that the Torso killer and Jack the Ripper were the same person, pointing to the anatomical knowledge displayed in both series of murders. Others argued that the killings were the work of a medical student or doctor who had gone mad, or a member of the aristocracy engaging in ritualistic murder. But these theories remained speculation. No evidence supported them. No documentation linked the crimes to any specific individual. The killer had taken his identity to the grave, and without that knowledge, the theories were nothing more than elaborate guesses. In the 1970s and 80s, as interest in Victorian crime experienced a resurgence, the Thames Torso murders received renewed attention. Books were written examining the case. Television programs explored the mystery. Amateur detectives proposed solutions. The files at Scotland Yard were reviewed again. The photographs were published. The locations visited by researchers hoping to find some overlooked clue. Modern forensic techniques were applied to the surviving documentation. The photographs of the remains were analysed. The measurements taken by Victorian surgeons were reconsidered using contemporary understanding of anatomy. But the conclusion remained the same. The victims were young women, probably from the working class, killed and dismembered with considerable skill. The killer had removed all identifying features, had disposed of the bodies carefully, and had left no trace of his identity. One researcher in the 1980s spent years trying to identify the victims through missing persons reports and census records. She compiled lists of women who had disappeared from London during the relevant time period, tried to match physical descriptions to the fragments of information available about the remains. Her work was thorough and painstaking, but ultimately inconclusive. Too many women had disappeared. Too little information about the victims survived. The names she proposed as possibilities could never be confirmed or denied. As the 21st century began, the Thames Torso murders were more than 100 years old. Everyone connected with the original investigation was long dead. The locations where the bodies had been found had changed beyond recognition. The Victorian London of mudlarks and gaslight had been replaced by a modern city of concrete and electric illumination. But the river remained. The Thames still flowed through London, still carried the city's history in its waters. The embankments were different now, reinforced with modern materials lined with modern buildings. But the water itself was the same dark current that had received the bodies in 1887 and 88 and 89. Sometimes tourists would take boat trips along the Thames, and guides would point out the locations associated with famous crimes. Near Westminster, near Battersea, near the reconstructed Blackfriars Bridge. These places where history had occurred, where bodies had surfaced, where Victorian London had confronted one of its darkest mysteries. The victims had no memorial. No plaque marked their deaths. No monument acknowledged their suffering. They remained as anonymous in memory as they had been in the mortuary, reduced to a footnote in the history of Victorian crime, names in a list of unsolved cases. Elizabeth Jackson, the one victim who had been identified, had no grave marker. The paupers' cemetery where she had been buried had long since been cleared, the bodies relocated to make way for development. Her remains had been moved to a mass grave somewhere in South London, buried with hundreds of other unclaimed dead, her individual existence erased. The killer, whoever he had been, had succeeded in his goal. He had killed without being caught, had dismembered with precision, had disposed of evidence so carefully that identification was impossible. He had operated in one of the largest cities in the world, under the noses of the Metropolitan Police, and had simply vanished when his work was done. Perhaps he had lived to old age, had died peacefully in his bed, had taken his secrets with him. Perhaps he had been killed in the First World War, his body left in some field in France or Belgium, anonymous as the women he had murdered. Perhaps he had emigrated, had started a new life in a new country, had never killed again. The mystery remained. It would remain forever now, too far removed from living memory, too thoroughly stripped of evidence, too carefully concealed by a killer who understood exactly how to evade detection. The Thames Torso Murders had become history, fixed and unchanging, a puzzle that would never be solved. Inspector Abberline, in the last years of his life, had spoken rarely about the case. When pressed, he would acknowledge that it was the one investigation that had truly defeated him. He had worked the case with diligence and determination, had pursued every lead, had used every technique available to Victorian police work, but the killer had been better. The killer had understood the limitations of investigation, had exploited the geography of London and the vulnerability of his victims, had operated with a coldness and calculation that left no opening for justice. Dr. Hibbert, before his death, had written in his personal journal that the Torso Murders represented a kind of perfect crime. Not perfect in the moral sense, the crimes were horrific, but perfect in execution. The killer had achieved his goal, whatever that goal had been, and had done so without leaving evidence that could identify him or explain his motives. From a forensic standpoint, it was a masterpiece of criminal concealment, even as it was a testament to profound human evil. The Thames continued to flow through London, indifferent to human concerns, carrying the city's waste and history toward the sea. It had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had seen plague and fire and war. It had received the bodies of suicides and murder victims, of accident casualties and the forgotten dead. A few more bodies in the 1880s made little difference to a river that had flowed for millennia. The water was dark and cold and patient. It kept its secrets well. The bodies it had carried were long gone, reduced to nothing by time and decomposition. The evidence they might have provided had washed away in the current, dissolved in the water, scattered across miles of riverbed. And so the mystery remained, locked forever in the past, preserved only in yellowed documents and fading photographs. The Thames Torso Murders had become a ghost story, a whisper from Victorian London, a reminder that even in the age of gaslight and scientific progress, darkness could move unseen through the city streets. The night is quiet now. The story has been told, the facts laid out as they were documented in those long-ago years. The victims remain nameless, the killer remains unknown, the mystery remains unsolved. The Thames flows on, dark and silent, carrying its secrets toward the sea. And in the archives of Scotland Yard, the files gather dust, waiting for someone who will never come, holding answers that no longer exist. The candle has burned low, the pages have been turned, and history, once again, keeps its counsel in the dark.